What we're trying to do here is to create a high integrity information environment that customers can see, which tells them about the emissions intensity of the products and services they're buying and allows them to make those choices. That's really the goal I think everybody is seeking.
Carbonsations, today's carbon industry leaders.
Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Today, we're joined by Laith Amin, who is the Vice President of Growth and Strategic Development at EcoEngineers, a consulting, audit, and advisory firm with an exclusive focus on the energy transition. Laith, thank you so much for joining us. As you may know, if you've listened to other episodes of the podcast, you know that we really like to get a feel for our guest background and how they ended up in this still very new space. So if you don't mind, it would be lovely to get to know a little bit of what you used to do before joining EcoEngineers.
Thank you, Pilot. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. Really looking forward to the conversation. And I think my decarbonisation experience has really been kind of mostly focused on energy decarbonisation. And I really got my opportunity to come into that industry back in 2004 after I completed my MBA in the UK. After that, I spent about 4 years living in Dubai. Working in corporate strategy, actually. So really on the advisory side, both helping international organizations come into what was a very high growth market for energy infrastructure development at that time, and working with national organizations to help them develop partnerships and understand market opportunities so that they could build infrastructure that would help them deliver energy internationally for many years. So, a really interesting role for me that was kind of positioned to help organizations build the ability to capture growth and to grow. I guess, in 2009, the global financial crisis kind of created an opportunity for me to go and work in engineering consulting in Western Australia, which interestingly enough wasn't really impacted in the same way as the rest of the Western world by the global financial crisis. So, in the huge movement of capital from west to east that happened during and after the financial crisis, Australia was really able to benefit by building infrastructure to supply energy in the form of natural gas to China and to some extent to the rest of Asia to help them develop their infrastructure. So in engineering consulting in Western Australia, where I spent about 5 years in my career, I really, helped build teams to identify opportunities to support the development of that infrastructure. And some of those projects were 30, 40, 50, $60 billion projects. So that was kind of a really exciting time in my career where I was helping organizations capture really significant growth from what was, I think, the beginnings of the energy transition, where we were seeing a real desire to move away from coal as a generation feedstock for power, and towards natural gas, which was lower in carbon and lower polluting in terms of the Chinese big cities anyway, and their air quality. So I think when I came here to the US about 10 years ago, that's the time when I really took my career into very much a transformation focus, which was kind of like where digital transformation intersects with decarbonization. And that's really always been my focus area for the last 10 years. So I've been able to do work within engineering, which has helped to develop technologies to improve the way natural gas leaks are detected and repaired in gas infrastructure, build platforms that can help to connect supply and demand in voluntary carbon markets, establish teams for companies that can help them to position for carbon capture and storage work. So, I guess where my career has really taken me right the way through to the present day is energy decarbonization, and where technology can be used to be able to accelerate that process and make that a more effective reality. And that really reflects the work that I'm doing at EcoEngineers, helping Eco grow its ability to deliver decarbonization support to large energy companies, and to be able to, wherever possible, harness the power of transformative technology to help people to do that at lower cost and more effectively at greater levels of transparency.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Laith, you recently published a white paper together with the Climate Registry titled Guidance for Developing Carbon Disclosure Legislation, How to Address Supply Chain and Data Quality Challenges. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, that white paper really reflects kind of 20 years worth of learning between the Climate Registry and EcoEngineers. We're an organization that has, even though we're a fast growing company, we've been involved in, primarily what has been energy or fuel decarbonization for 15 years now. And the Climate Registry also has, very, very deep experience, in particular on the policy side. So, the white paper is really a paper which looks at the groundbreaking legislation, which is, has been signed into law and is coming into effect in the next few years in California. The Climate Corporate Data Accountability Package, or SB 253, is what I'm referring to, where really for the first time in North America, and in concert with some similar efforts that we've seen in Europe, organizations that do business in California over a certain size are going to be required to disclose scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And those scope 3 emissions, the impact of those emissions really shouldn't be underestimated. I mean, this is an enormously consequential development, regulatory development potentially, because those scope 3 emissions can be an enormous share of an overall emissions picture of an activity or an organization. So oftentimes, if you look at what an organization would disclose as its scope 1 and 2 emissions, and those would be emissions in scope 1 that are directly produced by the organization through its, for instance, through its own industrial plant, the manufacturing process, let's say. The indirect emissions, which is oftentimes the energy that's purchased to run that plant, and the scope 3 emissions, which are all the embedded emissions that are reflected in the entire supply chain as a product or a service is produced and reaches the end consumer. And those scope 3 emissions, they can be 70, 80, 90% of the overall emissions environment. And those scope 3 emissions, those are the emissions that really industry hasn't got to grips with disclosing so far. And despite being the lion's share of emissions, and also have the lowest levels of disclosure, but the highest level of complexity. So the challenges of, creating a reliable and useful emissions picture in scope 3 embedded emissions for a given product or service, those challenges are really significant. And those supply chains are very, very long and complex in our globalized world that involves the production of complex products. Supply chains are very complicated. And I think what our paper seeks to do is to help the regulators and the legislators understand that not just the magnitude of the challenge, but to also understand that there are ways in which the complexity can be reduced by using technology. And there are ways in which the integrity of the data itself can be maximized in the approach to collecting that data. If we can follow a pathway that takes those opportunities into account, we could be on the cusp of something very exciting, which is to provide end consumers with information that can help them make choices in the products and services that they buy. And that potentially is an enormous driver for decarbonisation change. That information transparency, which will allow people to make consumer decisions ultimately, could be absolutely enormous and lead to something very consequential in terms of the decarbonisation that we all care about.
Now, since California State Senator Henry Stern, who also co-authored the California Climate Accountability Package that you mentioned, was also part of the discussion, I wanted to ask how much of the policy recommendations in EcoEngineers' white paper draw from the Climate Accountability Package.
Yeah, so I think the authors of the white paper are the Climate Registry and EcoEngineers, but we certainly did develop that white paper in observance and with deference to the corporate accountability package. And the senators Henry Stern and Scott Wiener, who during New York Climate Week, actually, I had the privilege to join them in a discussion panel recently. I think that the philosophy that they have brought to the development of this legislation is very aligned to the goals that the white paper seeks to deliver, in the sense that, while a lot of attention on Scope 3 emissions is paid to the audit aspects, how do we gather the data? How do we disclose the data in a way that develops conformity to this legislation? I think the key underlying theme of our white paper, and I think the key theme for the state senators, is that actually what we're trying to do here is to create a high integrity information environment that customers can see, which tells them about the emissions intensity of the products and services they're buying and allows them to make those choices. That's really the goal I think everybody is seeking. So, while I think industry is very occupied with thinking about how we're going to capture this data and how would we disclose it in a way that allows us to generate conformity, and that includes being on schedule to be able to disclose when we need to. I think we're also in a situation where we all want that data to have the highest possible integrity, so there is consumer acceptance of it and trust in it. And that's really when this legislation, I think, will be viewed as a success, is when customer buying habits and behaviors will change according to the data that they receive that allows them to make low carbon choices in the marketplace.
Okay. And with that in mind, are there any examples of the policy recommendations in this white paper that you could give us?
Yeah, sure. So I think, there's a couple of good examples there, which is to say that, even though we're talking about an incredibly complex situation here, I think there are allowances made. There are safe harbor provisions in the way the regulators are going to ask industry to make these disclosures, which give industry time to be able to prepare and develop high quality disclosures based on data integrity. So I think there's some cognizance of the fact that some of the recommendations in the white paper will need a bit of time and represent some change. But I'd say two good examples for you, Violet, in response to your question here. That I'd say one good example in the paper is that, the concept of traceability, supply chain traceability, and Scope 3 emissions disclosure, these are really very closely intertwined concepts. So organizations that take steps to develop supply chain traceability infrastructure are going to be much further along the track towards being able to make reliable disclosures and to create information environments that motivate end customers. So, in the white paper, we do talk about the fact that distributed ledger technology and, Web3 architectures or blockchains are really good technology environments for creating that supply chain traceability. And if we can develop a shared common understanding in industry groups about how to collect and report that data in a standardized way that not just one company can use, but many companies can use in a standardized way. That's really what the white paper describes as the pathway to high data integrity. So, I think the really important message there in the white paper is, this is a massive task, reporting scope 3 emissions information right the way through a supply chain. It's an enormous challenge, but the way to avoid cost accumulating in that exercise, and the way to avoid complexity interfering with the integrity of that data, is for industry to come together and develop a common approach. So we really advocate in the paper for the development of protocols which industry can develop for themselves, for industrial groupings, which can be followed by many organizations who are reporting. That will lead them to report data in the same way and have data recorded in a given technology, a shared use technology, where you can set up for much better visibility and data integrity. So, the concepts of producing data that can be verified and, wherever possible, audited and verified by third parties will be very important to the consumer when they look at this scope 3 data. And so, I think to kind of summarize all this, I don't think it's really accidental that this very consequential legislation is called the California Climate Accountability Package, because, ultimately, it is like if there is a supply chain which is producing a low carbon product, and another supply chain which is producing a similar product, but it's a higher carbon product, then the accountability there it ultimately rests with decision making that the consumer would make. So the consumer, wherever they wish, should be in a position to have that information, and I would hope select the lower carbon option. And that's where the accountability actually is ultimately generated. And that's going to be, if we can get data that the consumer can trust, they will make choices in that way. And if they make choices in that way, there's a huge driver for decarbonization there, a commercial driver, which hasn't really existed today. So I think what the white paper seeks to do is to really show that there's a pathway to providing that consumer confidence and that data integrity. And that pathway ought to be a pathway that avoids a lot of compliance cost, which, given the complexity, is a threat in this situation. So I think really, Violet, those are the two themes of the paper: how to produce high integrity data using measurements, operational measurements, and how to do that, avoiding some of the cost pitfalls that might otherwise be present in a very highly complex situation.
Perhaps a last question about the white paper before we move on, because I understand the concept of gathering data and making it transparent and all that. But as far as applying that, like in a practical sense, how do you envision the tech side of things happening? Surely this will call for some unified system that industry participants across borders will have access to and will sort of be universally accepted means of reporting on emissions. How do you see this happening?
Yeah, it's a really key question because, I think just in an environment where nothing really happens in terms of a shared industry response to that question, then what will happen is that every company will just do it its own way. And that means that with all of the products that are, represent consumer choice in a marketplace today, all the data for each product will have been compiled differently. And, that's going to have a real impact on the way consumers can act on that information. So I think just having that shared approach, industries developing protocols for how they're going to collect the data in terms of the just basic things like the format of the data or the time series of data, or, those kinds of things need to be represented by protocols where industries come together and agree, if we're going to collect this data, we're going to do it this way. So there's kind of like a call to action there to develop those protocols. And actually, if we're going to be disclosing this Scope 3 information in 2026, according to this legislation, then that means companies are going to be collecting that information next year. So this is really urgent, that industries should come together to define what these protocols look like, and wherever possible, really work with audit organizations to help develop those protocols so they're very, very practical in the way that the information is collected. I think to answer your question about the technology, Violet, itself, if you look at Scope 3 reporting today, it can be distributed. That Scope 3 information can be distributed over really 13 different categories. And if you have, for instance, an actor in a given supply chain that might, for instance, be, let's take a supermarket that's retailing fuel. They could look at that from a Scope 3 emissions environment, and they could say, okay, that's category 3, which is a category which describes fuel and energy related activities that are not part of Scopes 1 and 2. But they also might choose to categorize that same emission as a category 11, which is use of sold products, because obviously, they're retailing fuel. So the challenge there isn't necessarily that you would somehow double count that. The challenge is that further on in the supply chain, the organization that's receiving that Scope 3 data and processing it from that retailer might not even be able to see which category that emission has been placed in. So these supply chains can really easily become very opaque, and they can change during each reporting period. So the next time the supermarket in this example does this reporting, they might change that from category 11 back into category 3. And it might therefore look like your use of sold products category experienced a big drop in carbon intensity, and your fuel and energy related activities had a big gain in energy intensity, which is actually not the case. It's just that people can't see how they're reporting each other's data. So the reason why I believe blockchains are really the only sensible answer to this is they provide a very transparent and a very rigorous view of how data can be aggregated up and built up as a product moves through a supply chain. The blockchain can, aggregate data that moves through the supply chain with the product. And I think a lot of the answers to people's questions about, how are we going to do this in a way that is transparent and harmonized and, creates an environment where there's a history of something that can be audited to improve consumer confidence in the data. I think a really important part of that answer is about the use of blockchain technology. I really do think that is going to be the technology of use here. And the earlier organizations can build an understanding of how they can pilot that technology and trial it and deploy it and develop protocols that they can share amongst their peers to be able to put information into that platform in a systematized and standardized way. That's really the pathway that's set out in the white paper that will lead to the best case scenario for Scope 3 disclosures.
Excellent. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, since you said you were there personally at New York Climate Week to present the paper, what are your impressions from the event at large, and especially as it has to do with supply chain emissions? Like, how much attention did this matter get at the event?
Yeah, the New York Climate Week, it was really an amazing event. It kind of dominated New York, which is obviously a huge city. And notwithstanding the fact that there was a lot of activity going on at the UN during the same week, I think Climate Week has really begun to be seen by many as kind of the private sector or the industry-based version of COP. So, a little bit less about policy and more about action on the ground, bottom up kind of grassroots action. So I was able to attend sessions where I saw really encouraging and innovative work happening in carbon dioxide removals. And there were companies there that are really doing something meaningful, spending good amounts of capital on making carbon dioxide removals innovation happen. So, companies like Shopify and Stripe and Microsoft have done really, really impressive work in helping to create carbon dioxide removals and validate science, innovative science in that area. So that was very encouraging. I think there were, some of the more finance-oriented sessions I attended where they talked about Scope 3 emissions. I think were, probably gave me some more cause for concern, actually, rather than optimism. So, one area I very quickly touch on there is, there's quite a bit of talk about organizations legislation should accommodate carbon offsetting within supply chains. And there, we've got things like the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, which I think they're talking about up to 24% of a supply chain emission, Scope 3 emission, ought to be able to be offset in carbon offset markets. And, actually, I would not really say that getting into a situation where when a consumer receives a product or a service, they look at that disclosure, they look at that carbon intensity information associated with that product, and they can't see whether that is or isn't a high carbon product because there's been offsetting that's been going on in there. I don't think that creates the kind of consumer commercial movement that I've been describing in this conversation. So, I think that while it's super difficult to think about how we can decarbonize supply chains, and it's very complex, just accepting an environment where organizations might say, we're not going to be able to do this. It's going to take us really a long time. We need to offset. I think that is not as attractive as an environment where the consumer can see which are high and low carbon products, and they have trust in that, in the integrity of that data and the visibility of that into that supply chain's carbon footprint in aggregate, and they make the choice about which products they're going to buy based on that information. That's actually the powerful driver of decarbonization. It's much better than making that information opaque because we're doing things like offsetting inside that supply chain. So I thought that was a little bit less encouraging, that kind of lively debate in that area, in that offsetting area. I guess the final thing I would say is that, I think just the sheer scale of New York Climate Week, there's something very, very positive and encouraging to be taken away from that. So, when you go there, you'll see all of the Fortune 500 names are really there and taking it seriously. And there is a real sense that you get from being part of Climate Week that you're in a movement that's, it's the real thing. Organizations are increasingly taking discretionary spend into this environment and trying to drive greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And I think that's different to what we've seen in the past, where interest and spend has always been directed towards regulatory compliance or conformity, either avoidance of a penalty or acquisition of an allowance or an incentive. I think we're increasingly beginning to see that organizations are stepping up and going a little bit beyond that and thinking about more discretionary spend. So that was really my overall takeaway from it.
Okay, and with these impressions and more so perhaps your experience and observations in the field, how do you see the carbon accounting space developing in the future?
I think, yeah, it's a very important question, because I think we need to move away from initially what will be an environment where, or when companies are disclosing their emissions, they're using what is often referred to as top-down data. So this is a situation where an organization might look at making a disclosure about its emissions intensity, and they're using a schedule of emissions factors that have been provided by the regulator, or they're using procurement information and then kind of multiplying it by a multiplication factor that the regulator would provide, and then coming up with a number. And those disclosures aren't being, when they're done that top-down way, they aren't using measurements that are taken from the operational activity. And that's really what we need to see. This is where Scope 3 emissions accounting has to go in the future. Engineers will say, always say, you can't improve what you don't measure. So unless we start taking information from the operating plant, from meters, from measurements that are happening in the supply chain in the operational aspect, and then kind of taking that as a much more bottom-up approach to developing our emissions reporting environment, I think we're never going to really be able to drive the kinds of operational decarbonization improvements that we want. So, when I look forward in something like Scope 3 emissions, I would think that probably between, now and the end of the decade, at least for the next 3 years or so, industry is probably going to start off by using top-down data, and it's going to look and feel much more like an accounting exercise. It's going to be done in the office, and there's going to be a lot of factors used and a lot of procurement data used, and that's a great place to start relative to not doing anything, which is part of the past. But it's absolutely critical and urgent that the regulators understand that we have to move away from that environment towards collecting operational measurements, where you can immediately show if you've decarbonized something in your plant, the measurements will show that, and your disclosure will show that. And from everything that we've seen so far and the work that I've been involved in, I can say that there's oftentimes a 50 or 60% difference between a bottom-up measurement, an accurate bottom-up measurement, and a top-down office-based calculation. So that's a big gap. We have to start somewhere. We have to do this in a way that doesn't cause chaos. So I understand that we'll start off on that top-down data journey, but the sooner we can move to those bottom-up measurements and have them be audited and verified by third parties, the quicker we can get consumers trustworthy information that is very accurate and very transparent. And that's the goal, is to create that consumer movement. So I think that's the future of this data. Is it transitions as soon as we can get it there to being operational bottom-up measurements that are taken from the actual activity itself.
That is a very positive and optimistic note to be finishing the podcast on. But before we do, I do have one final question for you, and that is regarding EcoEngineers' upcoming developments or announcements. What's in the pipeline for the company that you can share with us right now?
Yeah, so we are, we have been doing very, very exciting work in agricultural decarbonization. And we're soon going to be making some announcements about our increasing footprint in that area. So look out for that in the new year. We will have, an agricultural, kind of like a smart climate agriculture practice established there, which will be doing really exciting work in all areas from soil carbon sequestration to, producing low carbon food. So that's really exciting. And similarly, we'll be making announcements about our international expansion in the early part of next year, in particular in Europe, as we build out our team there. So maybe, Violet, one last thing to say if it helps the listeners, is we have a carbon market snapshot, which is free and can be downloaded from our website. And that provides lots of really unique and interesting information about fuel, carbon incentives and prices and regulatory development. So we've always got things to announce in the snapshot, and it's a really great free resource for anybody who's interested in this work.
Absolutely. There will be a link for that in the description of this episode for sure. Laith, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed having you on the show today and appreciate the important work you guys are doing over at EcoEngineers.
It's been a great pleasure, Violet. Thanks very much for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.